So I made a community tab post not too long ago asking you guys if you believe Death or Possessed were the first death metal band, the first official death metal band, because they've always come up in contention of who is the forefather of death metal. They are both progenitors, clearly, and influenced hundreds upon thousands of bands that came after them. I encouraged you guys to share your own opinions and talk about which one you thought came first. And in this video, what I'm going to be doing is giving you guys my personal opinion on which one I think came first, the reasons why, as well as go through your guys' comments. But with over 70% of the vote, Death ended up coming out on top as the first official death metal band. Now, this debate comes down to Scream Bloody Gore by Death, that released in 1987, and Seven Churches by Possessed, which released in 1985. And these were considered the first two death metal records. And it is kind of complex because Chuck Schuldiner of Death literally said that Possessed Seven Churches was the biggest influence, or one of the biggest influences on Scream Bloody Gore and their sound. And so automatically you saw a lot of people bring that up in this comment section, with people saying, yeah, if Possessed literally was the biggest influence for Death, or one of the biggest, that kind of gives away the answer that Possessed was first. But the personal reason I think that Death came first is because I think Possessed was more in line with what you would get from, say, Creator or Sodom, or a lot of the speed metal and thrash metal bands of the 80s, which were testing speed and adrenaline and fury, similar to how, like, Bathory was considered the first black metal band, even though Venom had kind of been considered black metal, and that's its own debate, but Venom incorporated more speed metal and thrash metal. That's kind of how I see it with Possessed versus Death. I think Possessed was like the first step towards the direction of what death metal would be, and they would later become just a fully fledged death metal band, obviously, and Jeff Becerra is a legend and icon in his own right. But I think Death took that formula, took those patterns, and not only tweaked it and fine-tuned it, but perfected said formula and took it in the direction of what Death really was capable of and what death metal was fully capable of. Whereas I think Seven Churches is just a very heavy thrash metal and speed metal record that has some of the droppings of what death metal could become in the future, and I think it sort of predates that. Now, that's not to say that Seven Churches isn't massively influential on the death metal scene, but I think it was more a test and an experiment in extremity and intensity and what thrash metal and speed metal could be from a heaviness department. But I want to go over some of your guys' comments in this video, just for the sake of having a little bit of a discussion. So Spirit of Poison said, people are always so confident with the answer for this one as if it hasn't even been debated forever. So that is very true. It's kind of like Venom versus Bathory. Like, you can be very confident and have conviction in your answer, but it's been debated for decades. So is there really a right or wrong answer? Because most of the time when a band or artist is like the sole contributor to something, and who was the solo progenitor of a style, you can usually pretty safely say they were the first. But Possessed versus Death, I think even more so than Bathory and Venom, is a very interesting debate because you could make an argument for either band. Metal Death 166 says, first of all, I don't really enjoy and I'm not that familiar with pre-90s death metal and death metal in general, but even I'd say Possessed is basically proto-death metal and Death perfected it, if you like. That's exactly what my stance is. I think Possessed has a lot of the hallmarks, but aren't just the skeleton that death metal is built upon. Morbidus Strain 2004 says, I think everything about death metal is death metal except for maybe the guitars, which were more thrashy than Death, but I think the production choices and the styles of playing on the other instruments, including vocals, is enough to warrant it as death metal. And then Zach Gates here says, saying Death is the first one is like saying Metallica is the first thrash band. And then Kazador728 says, in my opinion, Possessed created death metal, Death popularized death metal, Morbid Angel perfected death metal, which that's a good take. I do love Morbid Angel. Dog Biscuit 752 says, I love Death, but even I have to say Seven Churches is the first death metal album. Apparently Chuck said Possessed was his main influence, though I have not fully researched that. Mr. Goldbar says, Death definitely was the first. Possessed is more so a thrash death transition band. I'd put Creator and Sodom there too. And then Hayden Scott 5612 says, Hellhammer. So yeah, I think that most of the time it's pretty easy to say that Death was the official first one. It just matters how much you classify the thrash metal beginners of death metal as death metal. Because if you're someone that thinks that death metal doesn't have to have the same extremity it later had, then I think you could make a solid argument and place yourself in a position where you could be believed if you said Possessed was the first, especially considering Chuck was influenced by the playing of Possessed, and it really did influence Death as a band. band. So it just depends on where you rank heaviness, where you rank intensity, and where you sort of draw the line at influence versus actively actually being something. On a personal level, I do think that Death is the first real death metal band, but that's not to say that Possessed isn't a form of death metal, or rather a proto-death metal band that had so many of the things that would later become staples for the genre, just not fully fleshed out quite yet that it would be in the future. Because if you listen to a lot of the classic death metal bands from the late 80s, early 90s, very few of them sound exactly like Possessed's first record, and you could chalk that up to, well, it's because there will never ever be another band like Possessed. But while I understand that, I think there's something to be said about not being able to replicate something because you took that style in a different direction, and what makes that genre death metal changed over time, and it kind of got moved around just like any other genre does when it gets created and then gets shipped off to another location with different things put into it to sort of form its identity and build that foundation up. What are your guys' opinions of this? You can let me know down in the comment section below if you think Possessed or Death are the first death metal band. I can't wait to hear it, and there's not a wrong answer. They're both kick-ass bands. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is. My name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.